Jeremy Park. I'm the CEO of City Current. We're honored to partner with Vaco on this series. Bruce Nix, who I'll introduce in just a second, and I have teamed up and done some podcasts and all sorts of different things focused on business agility and innovation. And so this is an opportunity. He's pulled together a great group of experts and panelists who are going to be diving into this subject and this topic of adaptive innovation. So we're honored to have our panelists, to have Bruce kick us off and lead this panel discussion. You're going to take a lot away from this event, so we're excited about that. We'll record this event. We'll be able to share it afterward. Also, too, we do want you to be engaged in this, and so as you have questions, if you will go ahead and put them in the Q&A boxes there. So there's a Q&A part, and there's also a chat feature. If you will put your questions in those, Andrew Bartolotta and myself will monitor those. We'll chime in every once in a while, ask those questions, and then toward the end, we'll take a lot of those questions as well. So let's go ahead and kick it off. The topic is adaptive innovation, growing despite the unknown. Here to lead us off is our good friend Bruce Nix. He's the Director of Business Agility and Technical Client Engagement for Vaco, which is a partner in City Current. Bruce, take it away.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as always, thank you for your great community contributions and partnering with us in this opportunity. As Jeremy said, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your Friday. Hopefully this won't be just another Zoom meeting, that you will be able to walk away with some insight from some individuals into innovation and how those activities can continue in your organization today. As Jeremy kind of alluded to, the idea behind this is obviously through COVID-19, many leaders, organizations, they're really being faced with having to make some hard decisions in the middle of uncertainty with limited information, and they may be tempted to really tighten the controls with the intent of protecting what remains after COVID impacts. And certainly many organizations, many individuals have been impacted by this. However, we're here to discuss the idea that if the need was ever present to continue these innovative efforts, it is now. We've certainly seen that happen in some of the low-touch economy, how some businesses have pivoted their services, and that's what this conversation is going to be centered around. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panel, who are what I feel are certainly experts in this field, and they are in some different environments, so we should get some good perspective around what innovation they're seeing, how they're going about it in their own organizations, and for some tips and traps. So I'm first going to kick it off because he's traveled all the way from Phoenix. Jamie Smith, who is the Chief Information Officer for the University of Phoenix. Jamie, why don't you give us a little intro into kind of your day-to-day duties at the university?
Sure, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I actually wish I would have traveled all the way there because it's going to be 110 in Phoenix today. So it's a bit toasty here. So I'm the Chief Information Officer of University of Phoenix. For those of you that may not have heard of us, we're one of the largest primarily online universities. So we have over 80,000 actively enrolled students, and 96% of those, while we still have 40 campuses, including one off Germantown Parkway there in Memphis, if you see the sign, 96% of our students only ever attend online. And so my role is really to support all of the digital platforms and properties that we have, make sure that they're up and available. As you can imagine, being an online university, the actual digital platform is pretty much the only experience that our students interact with primarily. So it's a really interesting role. I've actually lived in Memphis for about 4.5 years, I guess. Is there ever a former Memphian? I'm not sure that you can say that, but really been enjoying my 2 years here in higher ed, and even given kind of the challenging times right now, it's been really interesting to see the amount of change. So
great, thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. And our next panelist is Michael Graber, who is the managing partner of a local agency here called Southern Growth Studio, and their focus is on strategy and innovation. Product ideation. So Michael, welcome. You certainly see a lot of different things in this space in an agency working with a lot of different clients. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you, Southern Growth Studio, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here on City Current, and always an honor to talk with you, Bruce, as well as be with Jamie and Jay. Michael Graber, I'm the managing partner and founder of the Southern Growth Studio. We are headquartered here in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm a Memphis native and choose to live here. We work all over the country and all over the globe. We've been in business 14 years, actually started at the beginning of the last recession. So we've seen all these cycles come in and come back. And we're going to talk a little more about the impact of COVID-19 on all organizations, for-profit and nonprofit, but particularly as an accelerant of change as the conversation continues. But again, honored to be here, Bruce. Thank you.
Always look forward to hearing your insights. I always walk away with something new. So definitely thank you for being here. And then last, but certainly not least, and I'd like to point out that Jay Jump, who is the Executive Director for Business Transformation and Innovation at ALSAC St. Jude, he is actually the catalyst why this webinar even came to be, because it all started through a conversation between him and my boss. So Jay, welcome, thank you. And I'm so glad that we were able to pull this together with everybody's busy schedules, but please take a little bit and introduce yourself.
All right, thank you. Wow, I didn't know. I guess I got to be more careful.
You are the catalyst. It's all on your shoulders at this point, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, if the point of innovation isn't to catalyze change, I don't know what it is. Thanks. I appreciate you guys having me here, being a part of this panel. My name is Jay Jump. I'm the Executive Director of Innovation at ALSAC, which is the fundraising and awareness organization for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital is leading the way the world treats, defeats, and understands childhood cancer. And since we opened in 1962, our efforts have helped push the overall survival rate for cancer, for pediatric cancer, from 20% to over 80% today. And we're not going to stop. Innovation, the hospital and the way they develop cures is really rooted in innovation. And that is something that fuels us. And ALSAC is so important for that mission because no families ever receive a bill for the cost of treatment, travel, housing, food, anything, period, relating to their child's treatment. We just, we want them focused on their children and not how they're going to have to pay for that. So innovation is really critical in how we work together to make that mission advance. And now we're at the cusp of how do we take what we do and create global communities. St. Jude is already a global organization, but we know that there are more global needs that we can help solve. So kind of like jumping into some of the things we're going to talk about, but that is one of the reasons why innovation is so important to us.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. And I'm just going to go ahead and probably keep the focus on you because really that's the idea behind this was really, again, how has COVID really impacted and forced your organization, your people to kind of see innovation differently? And maybe it might help actually for each of you to just kind of, how do you define innovation? Maybe we start there because certainly it can have many different meanings. So, what does innovation mean to you, to St. Jude? And then how is this forced really your environment to kind of see that differently?
Yeah, really great questions. And these are kind of things that we're always talking about. So first of all, we like to keep things really simple. And to answer your question about how it's changed the conversation about innovation, like the pandemic, is I think we're talking about it in terms of, this is, proof that, when a culture of innovation is not an option. And that's what we feel right now. And not that it wasn't an option before, but circumstances were definitely different. And I think that this crisis has really underscored why the world is unpredictable and technology is unpredictable. So culture of innovation, we really feel like it's put it in that category of where it's just not an option anymore. And how we define innovation, we're not dogmatic about it, but we do have a really simple formula that we use when we're trying to create or, have sessions internally, is we say that problem plus reaction is a solution. And there is a time and a place for solutions. Anticipation plus problem is innovation. And that is just something that we do to try to drive the conversation at ALSAC to get people thinking ahead. So it's a really simple formula of how we define it and how we talk about it at ALSAC.
Okay, thank you, Jay. So I'm going to flip it over to Jamie Smith. And Jamie, because University of Phoenix was really, I mean, as you were mentioning in your introduction, University of Phoenix was really the innovator in online learning. So certainly would love to hear kind of how you guys define innovation today. And then, you know, how has, if at all, COVID has impacted you, since you have, as you said, you know, you're a digital first company. So how, you know, if you could take it from there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bruce. And you know, as you know, Bruce, we've kind of, even pre-COVID, we're on a journey towards business agility and kind of innovation, but really more what I call sustaining innovation. So sustaining innovation are kind of doing the things that we already do, but figuring out more interesting and innovative ways to do them better, frankly, because we've kind of been, while yes, we were built for this in some ways, right, as the early disruptor and early innovator, improving that online education not only is as good as, but can be better in some ways than having to drive to a physical location and all the things that are with that. But the other part of it is, I think expectations have changed, right? We kind of have 3,000 new competitors right now that almost overnight had to pivot into our space, right? And not only that, I think the expectations of what the digital kind of educational experience are going to advance probably more in the next 6 to 12 months than they have in the last 20 years. Higher ed is pretty yet to be disrupted. It's one of the few industries where you look where the costs have actually been going up over the years. And we've bucked that trend by actually, lowering ours and locking in our tuition. So not a part of that, but the rest of the industry, it's one of the few things that and where kind of innovation's been a little bit stagnant. And so, then I think the second piece is that kind of disruptive innovation, thinking about that, right? So maybe, all of our offerings primarily are kind of towards getting the 3 credit hours, progressing towards a degree. More and more, time is as big a function as cost in people. So they want to skill up very, very quickly. And so we have to rethink our core product and add a new value stream, which if you've been a single value stream company for, since our creation in the 70s, it's really hard to add that second value stream. So thinking about that's where we're pushing the innovation and things like short burst learning, credentials, a lot of ways where people coming out of the COVID crisis are going to want to kind of pandemic proof their work, really. So if you were a server at a restaurant or you worked in the hospitality industry or whatever, you're going to be very quickly looking to kind of skill up and reskill potentially and get your kind of next job. And we need to be there to meet them. And that may not be, kind of solving that with a degree, right? So it's forcing, and we were already a bit on that journey. If anything, it's forced us to double down. And really, it's put a real, so to kind of Jay's point, yeah, the notion of innovation is kind of always floating out there, but this puts a new focus and a new urgency around it, because we know that people are going to expect kind of online education to feel more like Peloton than like pen pals, right? So we know that expectation is changing. And, we need to also think about our core student is on average 36 years old, working parent. But there are a lot of 18 to 24-year-olds right now that are thinking that they may not go to a campus location and are strongly considering online. We don't necessarily have all the support systems to serve that demographic. So we're kind of looking at what that may look like in the new world. But no, it's a ton of change right now. Most of it in a good way for us, because we were kind of built for this. But again, it's putting that focus and that intensity around needing to innovate quickly.
Yeah, that's a great point around kind of creating that sense of urgency to really innovate and to continue to push forward, even when you're uncomfortable. And I'll probably come back to that in a little bit, because I think that's an important factor behind the innovation efforts. But Michael, you work with just a wide variety of clients. So what are you seeing in this space, and how some of the different impacts and really kind of what is your leadership direction to some of these companies?
Great question. So first, I'm going to define innovation because there are so many frameworks and there's so many soft skills, the mindsets and behaviors that require a culture to embrace meaningful innovation. But ultimately, we define it for all of our clients as creating net new value that matters to its audience, right? Net new value that matters to its audience. And it can be far out and disruptive. It can be core. It can be changing a product company into a service business, or, so it can manifest in many different ways, but the objective is to create net new value. Now, right when COVID hit, it was the same reaction as 2007 when the original recession hit, and that was everything shut down. So every contract we had was either null and voided or put on pause. Essentially, we had lots of proposals that had gotten verbal approvals. Those were put aside for a second. But then we noticed the same thing we noticed then, and that is that 10 to 15% of leading organizations decide to do what Jay so eloquently said, and that's to anticipate the future and to begin to read the tea leaves and begin to make sense of this new world and to pioneer into it. So instead of just battening down the hatches and closing, they decided to look at this crisis as an opportunity. Again, that accelerant of change. And so our phones started ringing off the hook. And then now all of our old clients are calling back. They're looking to pivot their business models, their products. They want to be relevant. They need help reading the futures and trends and the way that the world's going. The last thing I'll say here is that there has been so much activity with private equity and startups in this world. And so we're also working with a lot of well-funded startups, very high-growth startups, working with them to on their actual portfolios, but also taking equity stakes in these companies. So it's been a very, very advantageous turn for the studio.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. And you said something in there that I think is going to lead me to my next question, because I mean, all of you are in these leadership positions, but like Jamie and Jay, I think you guys probably control a little bit more than probably Michael. You have to influence. But I want to ask Jay, what during this time, because again, because people are being impacted, organizations are being impacted, those controls are being tightened. And as we all know, it's usually, well, we have to look to cut costs so that we can sustain and try to come out of this ahead, especially if we don't have any financial runway or whatever that looks like, any potential financial buffer. As leaders in the space, how are you supporting these innovation efforts? How are you influencing the continuation of these innovation efforts? And Jay, I'm going to start with you. Yeah.
We are really fortunate that we've got the right tone at the top, and our leadership fully embraces and supports innovation, and that, that from our CEO down. So that's a real blessing. I have a job because of it, and it makes life a lot easier for me. And it could be different, but I think early when the crisis hit, there's obviously business that has, we talked about it in terms of like the reactionary phase. So like you're in this reactionary window, and that's appropriate. It's absolutely appropriate to figure that out. But at the same time, we had conversations. There's a quote from Warren Buffett. I'm going to butcher it. That's what I do. I'm really bad with quotes, but it's something to the effect of be greedy when others are selling, and buy when others are be greedy when others are fearful, and fearful when others are greedy. And what that meant for us, it was like a philosophy of the disruptive energy of this pandemic. It's definitely harming some things, but it's also creating a lot of new opportunity. And just as much as we're trying to figure out what to do with our existing business models, we've got to spend just as much energy figuring out where the opportunities are so that we can take advantage of it. And that might mean fundamentally reinventing entire parts of our business. One example is physical events. we do tens of thousands of those every year all across the country. Those are not happening right now. And so we've got to figure out where is the opportunity. So if and when those come back, they're probably going to look different. So I think that like that ideological view, it was easy for us to jump to early on to try to figure out where opportunity was coming from out of the disruptive energy of the pandemic.
Yeah, very good. Now, Jamie, you've been in technology a long time. IT typically doesn't get the lion's share of the budget to begin with. So what, as a leader in that space, how do you keep those innovation efforts moving forward, even if we label it frugal innovation, right? Yeah. How can we continue those?
Well, yeah, I think there are probably two aspects of that, and kind of like both Jay and Michael said, it was really stark. One of the things that we have the benefit of being online is we get really immediate data, right? And March 11th, it was very stark. You could see a big drop in people looking at coming to school. I mean, it was dramatic. It kind of fell off a cliff because in the pandemic, I think everybody's immediate focus turns very, very short term. And not thinking about education's kind of a longer term payoff sort of thing, right? But then as the kind of realization sunk in, and a couple of weeks later, it was actually interest and kind of new signups were above what we had seen, because people were starting to shift their focus to what was next in some ways and preparing themselves for that. And I think from a technology standpoint, I guess I've never classified myself as just a custodian of the technology, right? If that's what you want from a CIO, basically don't bring me on, because I'm going to push innovation, and sometimes if things aren't broken, I'll break them just to put them back together, right? And so, and like Jay, very fortunate to have the president of the university and the kind of C-suite all very aligned on, yes, we know that we need to innovate or die. Right, and we spent a lot of time kind of fixing the core business over the last few years, making sure retention went up and student outcomes were great. And now it's kind of pivoting into what's next. I think so. It's great to have that desire. I think creating the framework in which you can innovate, especially in things that are potentially disruptive to your core. So if you think about going our average course, 3-credit course is $1,100. If you think about short burst learning, that's kind of a $300 price point, right? Is what's there. That fundamentally changes and will cannibalize the core business. And so what we're kind of setting out is the framework at which we protect those from the antibodies of the organization, or the white blood cells, if you will. Otherwise, I love our lawyers, but they'll kill it, or the CFO will kill it because it doesn't look like it has the same margin profile. There are so many systems in largest organizations that are designed to kill bad ideas, but they have a really hard time differentiating between good and bad ideas, frankly, and they'll kill the good ideas very early too. And so more for us, it's been help both enabling through technology, but then setting up that framework by which we can kind of protect those early stage disruptive innovations from the corporate antibodies. It is a challenging dance, I will tell you that, but it's something that we're kind of working on every single day.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And I'm going to actually, as you're talking about trying to protect against those kind of the antibodies and the stealing from other things, I'm actually going to, Michael, as you work with different clients, going back to what I mentioned earlier, and being a consultant myself, I know all we can really do is kind of influence, right? Attempt to influence. We don't have the authority to make the decisions. So how do you talk to your clients even around, these are the most important things. This is what we need to prioritize first to be able to, we feel like this is going to make the biggest impact. And then what's driving some of those decisions around the prioritization? I mean, what are some methods that you're using to help even prioritize innovation? Because a lot of times innovation is just creating a hypothesis, right? We believe this by doing this, and we might measure it by this. So how are you helping clients kind of prioritize those decisions? You're on mute, Michael.
For those who are willing to embrace innovation this time and to really move forward, they come to us with that anxiety. And because of this crisis, they're just coming out of that anxiety, that frozen state we were talking about. And they're looking to us to help them prioritize and help them begin to map out how they can be in the emerging world. And so we try to use some various methods. One's called the orthodoxy methodology, and the other is thinking through the business model canvas in short term and long term, and making sure that it tracks to set those priorities. We don't want to just assuage their anxiety, but again, our goal is to create value and new value, right, that really works for their users. So we've got to hit their audience right now in the mindset of the crisis, as well as creating perennial value. So it's almost like hitting two targets with one arrow simultaneously. So we have to talk to them at that level of truth. And it's interesting, for our corporate clients, the majority of the calls that we're getting is help us get over virtual fatigue. Surely you can innovate around that, right? And so we're doing all types of, using Mural and Miro and different software platforms to take very interactive workshops and turn them virtual, make them more interesting, but also gamifying a lot of things and coming up with ways where it's not just playing a bunch of squares, right? With talking heads like us right now. So finding meaningful ways to help them over the fatigue of this era and then create value. But it starts with their orthodoxies, and also by helping penetrate through that veneer of anxiety and getting to what really matters.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And Jamie, I'm going to jump back to you because I've spent time out there, and I know, the prioritization, no matter what organization you're in, is always a little bit of a challenge on what to say no to, what to say yes to. How are you guys prioritizing through this this current situation?
Yeah, so we do kind of 5 big prioritization sessions with kind of senior leadership all the way down to kind of our product management teams. And, to make sure that we're kind of implanting that business agility. Interestingly, we kind of did our first, we follow the Scaled Agile Framework methodology, and we did our first big virtual planning, I think it was the 14th and 15th of March, so very soon after this hit, where we had 400 people all together planning and prioritizing what was next. I was a little disappointed coming out of that. Most of the priorities we came out of that with were the same ones we went into it with, frankly. But I think that was more a timing issue than anything. And having gone through a recent portfolio steering and prioritization, a lot of things now are rising to the top that would not have made it against the core business. So we are running a short burst learning pilot, and starting that, we're running competency-based MBAs to help you shrink the time, and those things would not have been able to compete in prioritization against the core business. But now I think, because of the stark realization that this innovation is going to be at a much greater pace across the whole industry, as well as non-traditional competitors like Google and Amazon and Salesforce, frankly, that are getting into the education space. So part of that is, for those potentially disruptive things, we almost just have to reserve some capacity, because they always start out small. They always start out uncertain. The metrics by which you judge them are not going to be business metrics. They're going to be innovation metrics, right? So if you're looking at kind of an ROI perspective, or what we call weighted shortest job first, they're never going to win a prioritization battle unless you create some safe space and just say, we're going to kind of dedicate to 10 ongoing experiments of roughly this size. We'll prune early because we know 6 of them are going to be complete duds. 3 might look promising, and 1 probably will be promising out of that 10. But again, from a prioritization standpoint, you have to create that buffer for the innovation ones, or they'll never win.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jay, how are you guys driving some of the decision making around the prioritization of, to even move through the portfolio clutter, right, and into determining, no, this is the most important thing we must work on?
Yeah, this is you probably can tell I've been waiting to jump in on this one. I have thoughts.
Feel free to jump in at any
all the
time
thoughts.
too. Yeah.
Prioritization can be almost anathema to innovation. Like there's something there. It can be a struggle to understand what the objectives are. And I made a comment a few weeks ago. I said, prioritized lists are about have a shelf life of about 4 days. And immediately people chimed in and they were like more like 4 minutes or 4 hours. So I think there's something telling in there, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't have your priorities defined. I think how you define them is really important. So we've started our transformation under our CEO's leadership, starting a couple of years ago, was moving towards more autonomous cross-functional teams. And the idea isn't that the teams just go and run and do what they want, but it creates this concept of a water line. And the water line is just, imagine it like above the water line is like the strategic objectives, the priorities that are defined by executive leadership and the strategy office. And then below the water line is how those things get done and when they get done. So you've got to have a way to balance and make sure there's good communication. And I'll give you an example. I don't want our executive team to be thinking about every single e-commerce platform that St. Jude could be integrated with, Shopify, Magento, Apple Pay, Google. I don't want them thinking at that level. I want them thinking about, is it a priority for us to have ubiquity across all e-commerce channels? And then on the work throughput side, we can form teams around that, and the teams can go and tackle, make a roadmap and do all of their, team level prioritization. So how we work through, to answer your question specifically, is we make sure that there is really good, robust conversation about what the strategy is. And then that is communicated to the teams, even the innovation team. And so it's like an ongoing conversation between those two groups.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. And that, as I hear all three of you talk, and we've talked about, innovation really demands urgency and movement. And as I hear everyone talk about these different prioritization channels, I'm just reminded of, there can be a certain decision latency in that process. And, have you found, one of my most favorite games is Kill a Stupid Rule, right? I mean, we know that anything in your process that can look like waste is going to slow innovation down, even if it's at the simplest level. So have you found that you're making decisions faster now than before? And I mean, what's the reasoning behind that? And do you see you being able to maintain that coming out of this? If you didn't need these bureaucratic controls to make these decisions now, do you still need them as you come out?
So Bruce, I'll go first here. And I mentioned that this crisis is a great accelerant for innovation because we've entered the unknown. And so what I've recommended for many of my clients is that they just put their formal strategy from a year ago, their last year's strategic plan, on a shelf, because the world, the context around it has all changed. And they come up with a short-term strategy that's going to work now with some loose governance, and a longer-term strategy they can live into where they reprioritize how they want to be in the world. So that said, very much all those old constraints are gone, and many people are moving to a test and learn mindset and methodology, and they're pivoting really quickly to generate this net new revenue, come up with new concepts, market test, see if it gets immediate traction, and if not, they're much more ruthless about it in a very healthy way. It is almost the most fertile condition for meaningful innovation that I've ever seen in my career.
That's good.
Yeah, completely.
Jay, go ahead.
Completely agree. I mean, I'll just ride that comment. Fertile grounds, accelerating you know, I would recommend if anyone's like trying to start an innovation practice that you really root it in like the test and learn culture, because while it may seem like it's potentially wasting, in the long term, it pays dividends because you're running through things faster. You're finding your winners, you're killing, because you got evidence to make those decisions better than, you know, what could sometimes turn into like 6-month political debates on whether or not you should do something. Just go do it and see. And there was a comment in chat, like, what is one thing that you're doing now that you weren't doing? And I would say, like, top of my list is we are running through those test and learn, get things into market quicker than ever before. And it is so illuminating and clarifying on how we're getting through and navigating in, you know, like the virtual world. We can't do events. But we're learning so much faster than we would have normally. So our rate of learning is through the roof right now. And I think it's all because of the conditions that we're in.
And do you think that's momentum you'll be able to continue even coming out of this, Jay?
I sure hope so.
Okay.
Definitely advocating for it.
Okay.
So I know Jamie's chomping at the bit, I just want to say that in terms of the industry, innovation is kind of a nice to have, where you're looking at option value and future value in normal times, but it's a necessity now. And it's how it becomes the lifeblood. It's how you're going to drive revenue. It's how you're going to replace revenue. So it's moved up in corporate priorities. Jamie?
No, well, 100% agree. And Jay, we've kind of been on a similar journey to these empowered, what became kind of feature teams, unfortunately. And so we're kind of trying to pivot into much more of a deep product mindset, where each of the kind of product managers are really mini CEOs and more focused on outcomes versus output. I think sometimes bureaucratically it's easy to say, hey, did we deliver this X number of new features and whatever to the market and measuring that? But so what, right? And what did it really do? So I think this is the crisis has forced us to focus on very specific near-term outcomes of experiments and kind of double down on developing that muscle memory around what good experimentation looks like, right? It's not just throwing stuff against the wall, and that has to be all throughout the culture to sustain the momentum, as well as have a better chance or a better on-base percentage, if you will, for your experiments being right. So doubling down on kind of jobs to be done and those types of frameworks that provide deep empathy. We're also, partially because of this, accelerating our efforts to upskill just the whole notion of product management and experimentation across the entirety of our organization, from the C-suite on down, understanding that. So, we've gotten to the point where we can do a high frequency of experiments very, very quickly. The challenge is, how do you do that in a way where they're not canceling each other out, interacting with each other in negative ways, right? Competing against the same part of the market space where you're looking at innovation things. And so being smarter about that experimental operating system is what I think is going to be sustained coming out of this, because we're running so many at once. You have to develop some of the core instinct and processes at the team level, not bureaucratically, to make sure that you're doing that safely and kind of intelligently.
Yeah, and how do you go about hearing all three of you kind of talk through the innovation process? And I don't want it to simply be, I don't want to give the impression that there's only these little secret kind of closed door groups that are doing innovation, because obviously you still have, keep the lights running activities that have to take place. How do you get buy-in across all these levels that, no, we do still have to continue? I've heard you have great leadership support, but how do you get buy-in through these other departments that, we still have to carve out time from these certain individuals? We're going to have to steal Timmy from this group to go help us innovate on this project. How do you get buy-in across all those different hierarchies? I'm just going to let anybody take it.
So I'll go first, just because we set up that structure within the clients with whom we work. We call it embedded innovation, and we want to embed it into the culture so it becomes part of everybody's jobs and their metrics and KPIs and OKRs around these behaviors, these mindsets, and generating new value. And what we find is it really takes two things contingent on one thing, right? You have to have the concepts, the new thoughts, the new value, but you more importantly have to have the cultural receptivity, the culture to receive the new ideas, invest in the new ideas, test the ideas, and scale out those concepts. But you can't have either culture or concepts unless you have an executive sponsor who gets it. So that is the first thing I would do if I were inside an organization. Find an executive sponsor and then get that license to go and create new value and work on the culture simultaneously.
And Jamie is usually probably the best executive sponsor you can have if you're trying to get through innovation. So Jamie, but how do you work with your peers to get buy-in for this?
You know, it's always like some of the innovation things are a bit like compounding interest, right? They don't look very impressive at first, and then, you know, it kind of pays off farther down the road. It's the tyranny of the annual operating plan, and if people have things, you know, it kind of that can water it down or kind of force a short-term or very direct focus. And so I think we have a couple of ceremonies that I think have really helped. So we do every 2 weeks, we do a system demo like most, but a lot of that actually gets presented at the system demo aren't kind of these little sustaining innovation features. They're experiments that we're running, and the entire C-suite's there just to see that and ask about the experiments, comment on it, right? Show that it's really important. And also, you know, one really interesting thing happened where I knew we had turned a bit of a corner. We do an all university kind of video conference once a month. And the president actually celebrated the fact that our new homepage launch on our website performed 40% worse than the previous one. But we found out very quickly, like it didn't take us 6 to 9 months to get there and launch a whole new website based on that and whatever. We have over 2 million unique visitors every month come to our website. So it's a big deal. But we put it out there and found out really quickly it wasn't working, and then pivoted and then did another version that actually performs now 35% better. Right, so thinking about that and celebrating those failures from the president of the university, like that sort of thing starts to change people's mindset and gives them that kind of permission, that psychological safety, if you will, to not be afraid to share their failures as well as their kind of successes.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic on just creating that culture of trust, autonomy, and safety. And certainly a lot of organizations probably give lip service to, no, we want to experiment, but no one really has the hall of fails. Everybody, you know, performance and reward systems are set up on succeeding, not failing, right? So even that culture has to change to a certain degree. Jay?
I agree with what's been said. And I just, for people that are asking that question, I wanted to point out that our innovation journey started with an emphasis on culture. So before we had a team that was going to prototype and do things, our initial emphasis was around creating that conversation for culture and like what it meant to fail and what, fail fast and test and learn. And so that was, 18 months of laying the foundation and talking about it and creating a space to have the conversation for someone to say, well, what if I try this idea and I don't get the ROI? So we spend a lot of energy doing that. And I think it has paid dividends because you've got to create a common vocabulary. You've got to create common understanding. Those things are really, really, really important if you want to make that transition. And we have a mantra of people support what they help create. And so when we did get resources to actually start doing our own project work and our own technical work, we helped other groups. We tried to dive into what their challenges were and solve their problems for them so that it could give more storytelling power of how innovation and small experiments could help them grow their business and not be looked at as a distraction or a tinker shop where, the cool kids are playing with the fun technology. We are always very intentional about tying it into business value.
Very good. Thank you. There's a couple of questions I want to try to get to, and we have one in our chat as well. and we have about 10 minutes left. There's so many questions that I have, but one is, as we talk about all this innovation, and hopefully it kind of gets people excited to kind of go back and start some internal conversations, but you can quickly fall into a trap of innovating just for innovating's sake. I mean, what are some traps that people need to be careful of, and kind of what are some indicators that you might be going down the wrong path of innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I called, like, the one specifically, I think both Michael and Jay have touched on it, is one, the island of innovation, or innovation theater, as I like to call it, right? I think avoiding that and having it as close to embedded as you can. But I still think that for truly disruptive things, they have to be given space and an area for safety that's a little bit different, right? So, either that's rotational, where it's almost, you treat it like a venture portfolio internally, and kind of give people a 60-day kind of window to prove out their idea, to earn that next kind of tranche of funding, if you will, and have a much smaller and faster decision-making process of which one of those you kind of let persevere or die off. I think creating that for the disruptive innovation is really, really important. Otherwise, again, back to the tyranny of AOP, and I know this one has a return and it's always going to win, right? And I think that's a big mistake too, of trying to have it fully embedded. People are going to just kind of, the muscle memories back to that sustaining innovation, or more of what they feel is sure.
Okay. Michael?
I couldn't agree more. I go back to the story of the Doritos Loco Taco at Taco Bell, right? So even when Taco Bell and Frito-Lay were the same company, that concept went through about 12 brand managers, 14 product managers, and 10 innovation managers for a decade, and went nowhere because of just not being able to launch it internally, because they were only thinking about their paradigm, how they make things, how they distribute it, and not thinking about how they could create net new value. Then finally, once the companies were separated, one person got the permission that Jamie was talking about structurally. We're going to set it up lean innovation style, metered funding, tranches. We're going to do away with our normal bureaucratic way to get legal approval, way to get regulatory approval, and just pilot, right? Just see, take some very educated risk and move forward. And they did. And it was such a smash hit. Within the first year, they had to build 3 more factories because they were selling about 8 million a day. And I like to say that every organization has that potential, but they are their own worst enemies, right? And so you have to set it aside. You have to invite everybody to play, but you can't run it as part of your core business processes. So it needs a different set of governance, and that's part of the embedding culture. I'll leave it at that.
And then we have products like New Coke and Harley Davidson cologne that get out into market too quick, right? Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, I want to say, like, this is very tactical, but having gone through this experience, I can't underscore enough that there is no one size fits all approach to innovation. And you've got to do what works with your culture. You've got to do what works with your company's history. And I know that there will be tensions that have to be worked through. But I think the most valuable thing that we learned, and now that we've got relationships with other organizations, it's just been validated time and time again. Don't try to rush the process. There is no one size fits all way to implement innovation. And if you're trying to start up your innovation practice or grow your maturity in innovation, respect the process. You've got to learn, you've got to fail. And one of the I'll give you a specific example. I think early on, we did a great job around creating the conversation, and we just like fueled the idea generation process. And so we ended up having like this like overwhelming list of all these ideas. And so innovation sort of became like this dumping ground for ideas. And ideas are not bad. Ideas are a critical part. But, we got ahead of ourselves in that, and that led to some frustration. People wanted to be able to take action and see their idea get through, or, so that was some real valid learning, and we adjusted accordingly, but we had to go through that.
Okay. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Want to see if we can get to. Jamie, what's one specific thing that you're doing now that, or the university is doing now, that you weren't doing before COVID-19 hit?
So we were not doing the experimentation with the short burst learning, the non-degree kind of things. Again, it seemed probably too disruptive. So the idea had been out there. It's not a new idea, right? Back to Jay's thing. Ideas are kind of cheap in some ways, right? But it just kind of could never get off the ground until there was not necessarily the existential risk of the kind of COVID-19 for the university, but we understand the environment's going to be very different post-COVID. And so that was the final impetus of kind of getting that actually launched. And we couldn't get it off the ground before. So that's one.
Okay. Jay?
Yeah, we, a lot of virtual events, and we are, this is a good example. There's a lot of companies that are trying to figure this out. I saw there was another question as well, so I'll tie it into this, is like how we've been, impacted by all of the changes, like especially for St. Jude, the fundraising. And we have been impacted deeply because of that. And, we've been very fortunate that we've had many successful years. And so we're in a good position to weather through, but that doesn't mean that, our fundraising has dipped off as more people are like having their own economic struggle. So we are trying to leverage everything that we can to stay connected with our donors and stay connected with our supporters. So one thing that we're doing now and is learning how to have engaging and interactive virtual events. And I'm proud that we're doing that, because it's coming from a place of wanting to stay connected. And we know that when people choose to support St. Jude, it's more of like a partnership, because our work is missional and it is global and it is helping for, generations. So we put a lot of energy in trying to do that better and better every single time. And that's what I would say. One thing that we're obviously doing different that we weren't doing before is we're spinning up what we're, compelling virtual events to keep people engaged.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think that's probably, if you take a silver lining out of this, like I was in a workshop the other day with people from Russia, from Brazil. I think it's an opportunity to connect in ways that we never thought about before until this. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I'd like to try to close it out with probably, and Michael, I'm going to start with you. The final question that I probably want to ask is around, what advice would you give companies to prepare for the next pandemic? Because they are saying that it's possible to hit again in the fall sometime. So what can companies do today to better prepare themselves should a pandemic hit again?
That's a great question. And I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm going to answer it from an innovator's perspective. I'm a classicist when it comes to innovation, and the great McKinsey study, The Alchemy of Growth, looked at global companies that were prospering versus global companies that were going out of business. And what they found was that the companies that were prospering were investing in what they called the 3 horizons of growth: core, adjacent, and disruptive, right? At once, with some kind of mix, think of it like an equalizer. And they were recreating themselves and they weren't just hoping to get to this disruptive stuff on a rainy day. They had resources and projects aligned all 3 horizons. So I would say identify those 3 horizons and invest some in each to recession-proof your business.
Yeah, that's great advice, Michael. Jamie?
I think in some ways we're always like tempted to fight the last war, right? So you kind of like the Maginot Line in France arose out of World War I and was completely obsolete in World War II, right, sort of thing. And so I think, kind of pandemic proofing our organization is probably the wrong way to look at it in some ways. It's kind of future proofing the organization, and it's exactly what Michael said, thinking about some Horizon 2 and 2+ sort of investments. But really more than that, it's developing that kind of experimental culture. Because that's really, regardless of, there's going to be another triggering event, whether it's pandemic or something that's going to be a shock to the system. And and I'm kind of reading a book called The Invincible Company right now, and there's a lot of thoughts around kind of continually reinventing yourself, and having that as your core of who you are future-proofs you from whatever future event is out there, big or small in a lot of ways, right? It's really, really hard to do at an enterprise scale, though, frankly. And Jay, you touched on it. It's like, it's been a 24-month journey already kind of in this space for University of Phoenix. And we actually had that latent disruptor kind of notion in our DNA, but reawakening that and kind of building that back up has been really challenging. But I think, yes, that constant culture and being willing to kind of eat into your core business to look at what's next and new always is a key factor.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jamie. Jay, you want to close it up there?
Yeah, at the risk of violently agreeing with everything that Jamie and Michael said, I'll offer some really practical things because I do agree with them. So I think use this disruptive energy to make the changes you knew you needed to make 6 months ago, and continue to do that. And I mean things like shifting to more integrated teams in your organization, switching to open by default systems of sharing information. Like there's probably a lot of things like that in organizations where, well, we'll shift to Google Drive or some. You need to do that now and prepare your teams to be able to share more, because all of those little changes are going to help you and help you communicate faster and just eliminate the friction from inside your work process. And I do think that a lot of the changes that we're seeing now, like they're here to stay. So remote workforce is another one. I wouldn't sleep on figuring out what a good distributed team process looks like. That's going to be different for every organization. So I'm not saying that there is a template to do that, but I think it's taking those things that you know needed to be done and really leaning into those and getting those in place now.
Yeah, that's great advice, Jay. And so with that, I just want to say thank you, Jamie, Michael, Jay. You guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much. I think probably to close this up, and for anyone that wasn't able to get a question out there, please connect with all of these fantastic leaders, because innovation requires connection. It requires boundary spanning, vertical, horizontal, geographical. And so I think that's a great place to start. If you want to talk about innovation, is to connect with these, connect in your community, connect with myself. But thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, and hope to see everyone very soon.